So I thought I would talk about some of the challenges of measuring impact if we're going to move this issue of social impact forward. The good news is a lot of you have covered some of the things I'm going to cover, so I'm going to try to speed through this to avoid any redundancy. I'm going to draw on some of my own research and some research done by others, and I'm going to try to close with some recommended practices because I don't want this to be all negative and just talk about challenges. I want to talk about what we can actually do about them, because I tend to lean towards the academic side. So anyway, I thought I'd start with just some of the cultural and environmental factors impacting this issue of evaluation's role in social impact. So we'll talk about fragmentation, resource dependency, how program evaluation is framed and how people have a perspective for it, accountability and learning, efficiency and effectiveness, and quality signaling versus utilization. So fragmentation, we had this demand for effectiveness. We know that sometimes measuring nonprofit effectiveness is difficult. So that can sometimes influence programs that are easier to measure, but also carry less risk, get funded, which contributes to what I would argue already exists, funder risk aversion. I'm a little critical of funders, so bear with me. Which means smaller grants for less risky endeavors and over-diversified funding. So those of you that have taken a statistics course, imagine a scatter plot diagram with dots all over the diagram. Lack of third stage funding, funding that ramps up to scale to impact at a community or societal level, and therefore resulting in an inability to reach scale for social change. So we have a lot of small funders out there, and a lot of small nonprofits, and a lot of small grants, hence fragmentation. Resource dependency. Giving USA tells us that the annual aggregate increase in philanthropic giving, percentage increase accounting for inflation each year, has been relatively flat at 2%, with the exception of the economic fallout in fall of '08. But what do we know about the growth of nonprofits? That has exploded, particularly from the 1990s. So we have more organizations vying for this pool of resources, creating a very intensely competitive environment. And funders want to know about impact, so they're looking to evaluation. So are nonprofits going to view the demand for program evaluations strictly as an external stakeholder demand? Are they going to try to create intrinsic motivation within their organization to do this? Are they going to try to balance both? Did anybody ever talk about program evaluation being an ethical responsibility? It's amazing to me that we never couch it in ethical terms. You know, they have the Hippocratic Oath in health, right? Do no harm. Well, if we promise to prepare people for jobs, if we're a job readiness program, isn't that a promise and a covenant that we ought to uphold? But you never hear this couched in ethical terms. And do we couch program evaluation as administrative expense? Now, unfortunately, the nonprofit providers, along with the funders, have worked in harmony, in great partnership, in incorrectly saying that evaluation is administrative expense. Folks, that's incorrect. And we need to stop perpetuating that. It's a program expense. Accountability. To whom are we accountable for? For what, how, and why? This can be counterproductive to the mission, and as Elizabeth reminded us, sometimes we have competing demands. Here's a hierarchy of accountability I thought was interesting. Obviously, we want to be in those upper two sections there. We want to demonstrate impact, hence the whole purpose of this conference, and we want to be able to transform people's lives. We want to get away from some of the bottom realms of just satisfying, you know, that whole compliance thing. Organizational learning. It's learning new ways to achieve our goals, sometimes changing the goals. And this is something that's embedded in the images of our members' minds. It's driven by structures, systems, and culture, and it is a function of time. So are we going to be able to balance accountability somehow and create a culture of learning, or are we just going to have a culture of compliance? Or are we going to go for CQI? Or are we going to try to balance both? These are some of the leadership and cultural questions that nonprofits really have to ask themselves. Okay, question for you folks. Which of these two organizations is more effective? Okay, don't know. Anyone else? Yes? Does it have to do with effectiveness? Not enough data? All three of you collectively are correct. But what do we see? We're in love with these pie charts, right? These pie charts sort of get at the first E, the efficiency. They do not tell us how effective they are. Let's look at this one on the well, let's see. Yeah, it's your right, my right too. The 85-15, they, at least in this pie chart, can look like they're fiscally responsible, but 85% could be going to an ineffective program, so why do we care? We would argue that that's money not well spent, and I'm going to illustrate that here. Two dimensions here, fiscal accountability, programmatic accountability. This organization is fiscally responsible, but for a program that's not effective. This organization has serious problems. Okay, they're not doing well in either arena. Here they have an effective program, but maybe they don't know how to manage money, or maybe the program's too expensive. Obviously, this is a sweet spot where we want to be. We want to balance fiscal and programmatic accountability. Do we want to use this solely, and I emphasize solely, to attract funding or enhance our image or for PR, or do we actually want to use the evaluation results? Hopefully to improve the program, hopefully to learn more about the program, learn more about how to serve our clients. I would argue you actually can do both. I'm just cautioning against using it just for the first one. So, the phrase evaluation capacity was first found in the literature in 1999, so this is a relatively new concept. Human capital, skills, knowledge, experience, etc., and financial material resources necessary for the practice of evaluation, which segues nicely into the topic I'm going to cover this afternoon, evaluation capacity building. Now, you see that these authors use the word routine. Think about some of the routines in a nonprofit organization: managing people, managing finances, raising funds, marketing. This raises a question, again, for nonprofits. How do we add evaluation to those other things on our plate that we would call routines? What is it we have to do that? And Roxanne gave us some insights earlier today and from a leadership perspective on what we would need to do to make this routine. ECB is impacted by context. These are just some of the contextual factors that not only impact evaluation capacity building, but impact each other. So this is not a simple concept. It's rather complicated, and it's not something that can be achieved overnight. So, other people's research. The Innovation Network each year conducts their state of evaluation. So their most recent report, 2012, more than 70% of the 535 organizations in their study, which is a national study, by the way, are spending less than 5% of their org's budget on evaluation. Innovation Network recommends 5 to 10, so we're below that. Only 18% of the organizations had a full-time employee dedicated to evaluation. And we see the self-reported information as to where the organizations thought they were in terms of evaluation capacity. Some of the barriers, which again were covered earlier. No surprise here, limited staff time. Time, in every study that I've conducted myself or that I've read, not money, but time is always number one, and it's congruent here. Of course, money comes next, and then the expertise. Those are the top three, and you see some of the other ones. This is kind of sad for someone who teaches a graduate course in program evaluation. It doesn't seem to be a priority in these organizations. It's rather low, and research is at the bottom there. So again, how do we get this to be a routine? How do we get it to move it up on the priority scale? Okay, to my research, I did a qualitative study of 42 nonprofit human service organizations, and I didn't come up with this criteria. I just documented where the activity in PE was for each of these organizations, and it naturally fell into three categories. In the type 1, you can see it's very rigorous, comprehensive, very thorough. These are the organizations that were successful in evaluation capacity building. Type 2, the ones in the middle, some of them are sort of getting there. They're in the process. It's important to note at least half of the executive directors of the type 2 recognized that they weren't where they wanted to be and realized they had to do some more. And then type 3 was just one organization that wasn't doing anything. By the way, Roxanne, your organization was one of the type 1s, by the way. You guys were in my doctoral dissertation. I don't know if you know that. Okay, so these 42, the type 1, type 2, type 3, you see their size, their age and their size do matter. We're not surprised here, right? This is what we expect. The organizations that are larger, have been around longer, have resources, are more likely to engage in this activity. So I talked to the executive directors of the type 1 organizations, and I asked them what steps they took to build evaluation capacity, and these were the steps that they took. So I'm going to just cherry pick the less than obvious ones. Understanding, that shouldn't be overlooked. If you're going to build capacity for something, you have to have the comprehensive understanding of what you're building capacity for. Driving the process. A lot of them, their quotes were, as the top staff person, if I don't drive it, it's not going to happen. And a lot of them said, well, we can argue org learning would take place throughout the whole cycle. It particularly took place where the stakeholders used the results, realized the benefits, and then learned. And then again, this is a continuing process as we embed this into the culture. So a sneak preview for recommended practices for EDs looking to build evaluation capacity. I also talked to 20 board chairs. On a positive note, most of them indicated a relationship between the organization's mission and the call for evaluation. Some of the less than desirable results were there was a variance in how they described program evaluation. They tend to focus more on inputs and resources. They seem confused between program and organizational evaluation. And most of them just lacked a focus on program improvement. It wasn't really a natural part of any of our discussions. And maybe here's some clues as to why. Their focus was on fiscal responsibility. And again, they deferred ensuring programs are effective to the actual organization, i.e. the staff itself. They didn't see that as part of their responsibility. And it plays out again here when I asked them what the top 3 priorities are for the board and for the person as the board chair. And you see, again, emphasis on financial stuff, which none of us are going to argue is critical, but a seemingly lacking of anything related to program effectiveness, which I would argue is also part of the board's responsibility. Okay, another study I did in 2011 is a mixed method study of professional fundraisers. They're members of AFP, and you see some of the study's parameters here, did focus groups and surveys. The purpose of this study was to try to understand how the increasing demand for evaluation impacts specifically the work of fundraisers. I hadn't seen anybody do a study like this yet, and I was kind of interested as to how it impacts these people. So I asked them if they're interested in professional development and program evaluation, and we see a lot of them said yes, they would be interested in that. Asked them the same question about ECB, and they're interested in that as well. 80% of them are incorporating some sort of program evaluation information into their fundraising work. And here's some of the pieces of information. The number served, program outcomes, description of the program delivery, and consumer satisfaction. Percentage indicating PE has been helpful to their fundraising. That came out rather positive at 95%. And here are some of the reasons why. They're better equipped to tell the story of their programs to potential funders. They themselves have a better understanding of the programs. And 54% said it helped them raise more funds. Here's some of the challenges from the funding world. These are percentages where this particular expense was never paid by the funder. And these are obviously things that are necessary for the evaluation process. Anecdotally, a lot of them said in the focus groups that a lot of the same funders that required evaluation also didn't pay for it. Well, that kind of puts a squeeze on the nonprofit that hasn't planned or budgeted for it, but yet is required to do this and report this back to the funder. I asked them if they've advocated to their organization. It seemed like a logical question. If they've determined this is important, well, what have you done within your organization to try to get this done? And 62% said, yes, they have, and here's who they've advocated for to have their programs evaluated. The success in the advocacy effort obviously is mixed. About 40% yes, 47% varied depending on who they spoke to, 9% no, and 4% said they didn't know. So that segues into some recommended practices. We've looked at the research now. We've talked about some of the challenges. So what are we going to do about this, right? ED CEOs and their boards really need to look at balancing this external pull from stakeholders like government agencies, United Way's foundations, and develop an internal push and an intrinsic motivation within the organization. So it doesn't mean we ignore those external demands. It means we take them and we integrate them into our process within our organization. Environment and culture conducive to organizational learning and continuous improvement. Someone earlier today mentioned that the staff got excited when the evaluation process help them learn about the program. So org learning is a key component here if we're going to get the buy-in from our program staff, which we need. Some other recommended practices. How about making sure program evaluation is discussed regularly at board meetings? If I had a nickel for every time someone said, gee, wouldn't it be nice if a board member just once raised their hand at a board meeting and said, how are we doing? How is our program doing? And quite often those questions are not asked. Making sure program evaluation is part of the organization's strategic plan. Budgeting for evaluation. Yes, it does cost. And what's the cliche? Don't tell me what's important, show me your budget. If you ever want to see how an organization prioritizes things, look at their budget. You know, you can hear people go on and on about, you know, come up to a podium like this and say what's important. You really want to see what's important, look at their budget. These folks need to participate directly in the process. Doesn't mean they need to do all the same thing, but they need to participate in the process at some level. They need to help involve and engage stakeholders. Personally support and locate additional champions to participate in the evaluation process. Provide resources and allow enough time. Give program staff the blessing of making sure they have enough time to engage in the process. Provide professional development. Budget for them to go to conferences, workshops. Incorporate evaluation in the policies and procedures. That's a good way to put teeth into this. And develop a formal, detailed ECB plan. That's your strategic plan for building evaluation capacity. Utilizing staff, developing a revenue stream to support ECB. There is a large nonprofit in Atlanta called Families First, right down the street from Roxanne's organization. They, 1987, they engaged in a capital campaign, not only for bricks and mortar for their building, but for programs, because there was some new research on family counseling and they wanted to develop new programs. So they put some money aside from that capital campaign and called it a program endowment. Well, 26 years later, there's $1 million in that endowment. They've never spent an outside penny on any of their evaluation work. So this can be done. Again, priorities, budgeting, right? Managing the political environment. Telling the program staff that they need to engage in this, it's part of their work, but also making sure it's not punitive. This is not Big Brother watching over their work. Getting the board engaged, and attempting to balance the imbalance of power with funders. You know, Elizabeth, you were describing, wouldn't it be nice if we went from 90% to 10? Yeah, I think there's plenty of work to be done there. And the good news is, a lot of funders I've been finding lately actually want that dialogue. A lot of them are participating in the grantee perception study from the Center on Effective Philanthropy in Cambridge, and a lot of them are saying, we want to hear more from our grantees. So I think this is an opportunity for nonprofits to actually seek this dialogue and engage in it. For fundraisers, plan ahead and manage time. So if you know you're going to be, there's an evaluation component in the grant, call in the evaluator when you are thinking about applying for the grant. Not after you get the grant, the program's up and running, and you realize the report's due, and you think the evaluator is going to come in and somehow magically save you. It's a little too late. Communicate regularly with program staff. The fund development people and program staff should work like this, because the fund development people are going to need information about the programs to report back to the funder. So these stakeholder relationships are very important. Incorporate evaluation designs before applying for funding. That's, again, involving evaluators ahead of the time. Allocate resources dedicated to this. Secure executive top-down support. And that can mean different things. Some of us may think we get top-down exec support when the exec comes up and says, I support this at a staff meeting, this is important, and walks away. That's not what I'm talking about here. Not saying you support it, but actually doing things to support it by planning and budgeting and those other things. Be selective when applying for funds. Now that's easy for me to stand up here and say that because I'm not the one running the nonprofit. And when you have carrots and funding dangling in front of you, it's very tempting to go for that funding. But what I'm suggesting is, if the funding comes with strings attached that do not match your program or your outcomes, you're actually taking a big risk in applying for that funding because you're going to have to morph your operations and your program into what the funder wants. So sometimes the best thing you can do is pass on the grant or say no. So to recap recommended practices for fundraisers, we have these external stakeholders who have this demand for program evaluation. This impacts the work of the fundraiser, who has to raise funds because resource dependency tells us that nonprofits are open systems and they're not self-sustaining. They need to get money from these external stakeholders. They can advocate to their organization to build evaluation capacity, which therefore will enable the organization to meet this demand for program evaluation. So I'm hypothesizing here that because the fund development person is working hard to bring money into the organization, that he or she is going to have the ear and attention of the ED and the board. Very important person. So I'm saying they're in a good position to advocate for this. Recommendations for brand new organizations. These are nonprofits that are forming. I'm going to go through two paradigms really quickly here. This is a paradigm for why programs are developed. There's an unmet need in society. Group of entrepreneurs, it's bugging them that they want to actually do something about it. So they start tinkering with this mission and how we're going to address this unmet need in society. They realize they need to establish a formal organization to do so. They start developing programs. They deliver those programs all in the hopes of meeting that unmet need in society. And this is rather typical. I still see a lot of this out there in the environment. I'm going to now suggest a switch to a different paradigm for program development. A lot of these things are still going to be the same, though. Unmet need in society. But before we pass go and collect 200, we're going to stop and we're going to conduct research. Research meaning two things. Number one, research into why we have the unmet need in society in the first place. That's called root cause analysis, and I would argue not enough nonprofits engage in this. Research definition number two, who has already tried to address this unmet need? How have they done so? Have they been successful? Have they not? What can we learn from that? You may decide at this point, we're not even going to start a new organization. You know, we're going to go work with these people over here. We're going to go work with Boys and Girls Clubs because look at what they're doing with evaluation. We don't need to reinvent this. Still going to be entrepreneurial, right? Still going to develop a mission. Probably still going to develop an organization if we feel we're still on the right track. Now we're going to determine the outcomes. We've done our research. We're educated customers now, right? We can define the desired change we want to see in the consumers we serve. Notice that this comes before the development of the programs, not the other way. This is what we heard earlier this morning, right? Not outcome intended, outcome driven. Remember when Roxanne covered that? This is the difference. We're still going to deliver those programs, but now we're going to evaluate the programs so we can actually talk about how well we've addressed this unmet need in society. Everybody clear on the difference between these two paradigms? Okay. Overall tips here, be patient. Building capacity for anything is going to take some time. It's not going to happen overnight. Again, have courage, know when to say no, particularly if these, the outcomes that the funders want are not in alignment with what you do. I see a lot of nonprofits trying to take credit in their programs for things that their programs aren't doing. I see the other way, a lot of nonprofits punishing themselves for environmental factors that are beyond their control. I'm suggesting a third option. Focus specifically on what your programs are intending to do and the outcomes that those programs are resulting in. And again, work in partnership, very important. For funders, we're seeing more of this. We're seeing more funders now looking to partner with their grantees. Hopefully this will result in less top-down authoritative relationships. Initiate and welcome dialogue with grantees. I did a small qualitative study of 24 funders of different kinds, a mix of corporate giving programs, foundations, government agencies. And for those that required evaluation but didn't fund it, I asked them a question. I said, if a potential or existing grantee suggested a line item to cover evaluation, would you seriously consider it? 100% of them said, yes, we would, but nobody ever asks. So we have this little, you know, it's prom night, right? Everybody's on the perimeter. Nobody wants to ask anyone to dance, and we're in gridlock, right? Nothing happens. So I would argue because of the imbalance of power in the relationship, it's the funders that really need to set the tone and say, we welcome your dialogue, we welcome your suggestions. If you want to restructure this grant application, let's talk. again, come to the understanding of the intended program outcomes. We had talked about competing demands earlier today, so we want to flesh those out. And very simple to funders, crowbar open your wallets and pay for evaluation. You keep saying it's important, right? If we say something's important in our lives, we typically are willing to plunk down money for it, right? So we need to see more funder support for this. Again, back to that paradigm shift, it's actually worth repeating. If you walk away today with nothing else from my presentation, please walk away telling your friends, relatives, and neighbors that evaluation is a program expense and not an administrative expense. We really need to correct that. It's a mistake. It's been perpetuated in the sector for decades. It's just flat out wrong, and we need to change that. We also need to be open and willing to get what might be perceived as negative information about our programs, but really this is all learning opportunities. And yeah, this is part of appreciative inquiry, and this is part of putting a positive spin on it. But if an organization can get to this paradigm where they're okay with hearing about what's not working about their programs as well as what's working, they're halfway there. They're halfway to building the evaluation capacity that they're going to need. Okay, thank you for your time, and I guess we'll take questions at the end of this. Okay.